Hello, my name is Erica Lome. It's such a pleasure to be back in Lexington, Kentucky. For those who did not grow up in this city, the name Milton Paul is likely unfamiliar. But here, at least among the antiques crowd, he's a bit of a local legend. A talented craftsman known for his beautiful Colonial Revival mirrors, the products of Milton Paul's labor adorn Lexington's most celebrated interiors, including one we visited yesterday. The mirror in the front hall of Hopemont was made by Mr. Paul sometime in the 1950s, and you can see that mirror to the right on this slide. Today I'm here to shine a spotlight on Milton Paul, as well as the larger circle of black cabinet makers who supplied Lexington with furniture in the early to mid-20th century, most of whom graduated from the cabinet making program at Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, a local school which closed its doors in 1967. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to describe how I came to this topic and acknowledge a handful of individuals who supported my research. As a doctoral student at the University of Delaware, I studied the Colonial Revival movement in America and became interested in the manufacture, promotion, and consumption of reproduction antique furniture between 1890 and 1945. During my research, I came across an article written in 1940, published in the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. This feature story, titled Craftsman and the Bluegrass, was about Paul V. Smith, a cabinet-making teacher at Dunbar High School. Smith posed for this photograph surrounded by the work of his students. According to the story, quote, "In an age of machine production, when the shoddy and ordinary have become commonplace, Smith and his students make most of their Sheraton, Chippendale, and Duncan Fife reproductions by careful and loving hand labor." End quote. This immediately piqued my interest. I was already studying the contributions of immigrant cabinet makers to the antiques and reproduction trade, which are more easily traceable in museum archives. As you might expect, black craftspeople and craftspeople of color are less visible in the documented history of furniture making in America, though their involvement is indisputable. I decided to do more research into the Dunbar School, and lo and behold, some intrepid Googling led me to another, more recent article about one of Smith's graduates, Milton T. Paul, who passed away in 1988. This article was written by local antiques dealer Jerry Shrout with the help of Milton Paul's son Billy. With these two articles, I knew I had the foundations of a dissertation chapter. Ultimately, that chapter would be about the education and training of cabinet makers in America in the late 19th and early 20th century, and how the concurrent fashion for colonial revival furniture informed the professional opportunities offered to and taken by craftsmen of color. Milton Paul ended up being the inspiration and subject of this research. In summer 2019, I traveled to Lexington to spend some time in the local history archives of the public library and sought out members of the community who knew Mr. Paul. With the help of Jerry Shrout, I was able to track down two antique dealers who had worked with Mr. Paul for decades, Betty Hoops and Z. Faulkner, names that some members in this audience may recognize. To my great surprise, Betty and Z were not only available, but were thrilled to talk to me about Milton Paul. And of course, I could not tell his story solely from the perspective of these professional associates. I am incredibly fortunate to know Marvetta Paul Brown, Milton Paul's daughter, who shared with me precious memories of her father and helped me contextualize this research. I want to give a big thanks to that family for their contributions to this presentation. My chapter ended up being a mixture of traditional archival study, object analysis, and oral history, and I look forward to presenting the fruits of that labor to this audience today. Before we dive into Milton Paul's story, I'd like to begin by giving an overview of the Dunbar School and describe the larger historical forces that informed its creation. In 1913, William Henry Fouse arrived in Lexington, Kentucky, with the goal of educating its black youth. He was the first black graduate of Otterbein College in Ohio and had taught in several Indiana and Kentucky schools before coming to Lexington to become principal of the Russell School. In the following years, he and his wife Elizabeth founded the Bluegrass Oratorical Association and the Bluegrass Athletic Association, along with other literacy and arts programs in Fayette County. In 1921, Fouse secured funding from the city and the Educational Board to build Paul Laurence Dunbar School, named after the poet whose parents were from Kentucky. During its first 25 years of operation, Dunbar graduated over 900 students and received an A rating by the Southern Association of Secondary Schools and Colleges, the first African American high school in the state to do so. William Faust patterned his educational philosophy on the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois and equated education with economic success. In his view, a general education in the arts, sciences, and humanities would provide the tools for Black youth to succeed in life, and ideally, they would become independent business owners and community leaders. At the same time, Faust was keenly aware of the realities of getting a living in a segregated South. This likely motivated his hiring of Paul Smith as Dunbar High School's cabinet-making teacher in 1923. Paul Smith's background and training informed his own educational philosophy, which differed from Faust's in that he placed an emphasis on manual learning and industrial arts education as a means of Black uplift in the South. Smith began his training in carpentry in 1902 at Berea College, the first non-segregated coeducational college in the South, but his education was cut short when the state of Kentucky forced segregation on Berea in 1904. Undeterred, Smith made his way to Hampton in Virginia to study cabinet making and later represented the school's cabinet making department at the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition of 1907. The Hampton Agricultural and Industrial School was founded in 1868 by Union General Samuel Chapman Armstrong and was supported with funds from the American Missionary Association. Begun as a school to train teachers up to a 10th grade level of education, Hampton specialized in a variety of manual and artisan trades taught to both African Americans and Native Americans. By the 1890s, its educational mission was threefold. First, to supply training and business skills which would benefit students in real life. Second, to give students an education that would otherwise be beyond their reach. And third, to uplift the race by building character and teaching responsibility. These were outlined in its educational materials. The cabinet-making and carpentry department curriculum familiarized students with shop practices and taught them the differences in historic styles of furniture, providing close study of furniture donated by wealthy patrons. While the cabinet-making curriculum stressed proficiency in benchwork, classrooms also provided access to planers, circular or bandsaws, and pulley lathes, all of which were considered ordinary and rudimental. Graduates applied these lessons towards making, quote, useful and attractive furniture, end quote. At an 1884 meeting of the Hampton Institute Alumni Association, a speaker reframed the work of learning trades as a means of building character and enjoined his fellow educators to, quote, recognize with all our heart, mind, and strength the dignity of labor, end quote. Armstrong and his contemporaries believed that by promoting the moral value of hard work and efficient service in Hampton students, they would graduate as teachers and spread a similar ethic among the Black working class. Here are some more pictures. Hampton's biggest supporter was also its most famous graduate, Booker T. Washington, who became the leader of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1881. At Tuskegee, Washington sought to combat negative stereotypes and promote alternatives to farming among rural African American communities by producing Black artists of high caliber. Promoting his program to white investors, Washington described Tuskegee as a rural haven where labor was refashioned as a means of producing, in his words, beauty, dignity, and a civilizing power. Washington sought to combat negative stereotypes. I already said that. Not everyone agreed that the Hampton Tuskegee model was the best direction for educating Black Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois critiqued the model for what he called its accommodationist stance towards education and labor. In his mind, Hampton was a fundamentally conservative enterprise aimed at adjusting African Americans to, quote, a subordinate social role in the emergent New South, end quote. But while Hampton offered newly emancipated men and women a means of educating themselves and their communities, its politics and philosophies were fundamentally based on maintaining structural inequality. More than that, the work Hampton graduates trained to do did not necessarily align with the opportunities available to Black craftsmen in their chosen trades. This was especially true for industrial manufacture. By 1910, the furniture trade, for example, comprised approximately 160,000 workers, but only 2.7% were African American. And within the factory setting, most Black men worked as teamsters and as caners and seaters, which could be outsourced. Both jobs removed Black workers from the factory floor. The way I read it, The Hampton-Tuskegee model gave Black students the trade skills for economic self-sufficiency, and instead of applying those skills in the industrial workforce, they were encouraged to operate independently in smaller communities where they could maintain a dignified artisan position in society. The statistics mirror this impression, as the job category in the furniture trade with the largest percent of Black workers was furniture repair, and Hampton students were primed for this kind of small shop, local work. This is what Paul Smith learned as a graduate of Hampton, and this is what he brought with him as he traveled south as a teacher, ultimately landing in Lexington in the 1920s. Hopefully you can see how this connects back to the Dunbar School, where two different yet not incompatible models of uplift were in conversation between William Faust's model of social and economic uplift through education and Paul Smith's dedication to teaching students the skills they would need to make a respectable living outside the formal structure of the furniture trade. For this talk, we're going to follow Smith's path and see how he conducted his cabinet-making program in Lexington. Dunbar was a general high school, not a trade school. Over 30 students took Paul Smith's classes as an elective each year, but he usually worked closely with a group of 5 to 7 who trained full-time. Smith also offered supplementary courses to high school graduates or young men who had quit school early for financial reasons. Smith taught students cabinet making the way Hampton taught him, stressing the concurrent development of hand skills and mental acuity. Ninth grader Samuel White reported in the school newspaper that, quote, such work is selected as will give the best physical development through free, vigorous movements. The habit of careful and independent thinking is developed through the personal estimate of our work, which we are called upon to make. We are learning to bring out the hidden beauty of raw materials. We are learning by doing, end quote. One photograph in the Dunbar Echo, the monthly newsletter published by students, showed the cabinet-making department in 1932 hard at work in the classroom, which was notably smaller and less well-equipped than the shop classrooms in schools for white students. Nonetheless, the accompanying caption remarked on the finest pieces of furniture made by Professor Smith's class. The completion of a beautiful cabinet for the school's administrative offices was celebrated for its carving and embellishments, as very few pieces of furniture of this kind is ever done anymore, reported the newspaper. The quality of workmanship made in the Dunbar classroom soon became known to the community. According to the piece in the Crisis, quote, Mr. Smith and his boys do almost all the furniture making in the vicinity, end quote. In addition to institutional orders from local schools and businesses, the Dunbar School designed, repaired, and reproduced antiques and period furniture, quote, for a growing number of delighted patrons and collectors, end quote. These patrons included some of the outstanding white citizens, which is a quote, of Lexington, including George P. Sprague, the psychiatrist at the city's High Oak Sanatorium, John Yellman, the vice president of First National Bank in Lexington, and Walter Hillenmeyer, owner of Hillenmeyer Nurseries. They also made a complete suite of period furniture for the New York apartment of Lexington lawyer and businessman Barclay Story and his wife. These prominent clients bolstered the reputation of Dunbar and ensured the continued financial health of the cabinet-making program. Much of the woodworking equipment purchased by the school was paid for by funds earned from making fine furniture. Some of the Smiths graduates went on to become teachers themselves, as James Adams did when he became head of the cabinet-making department at the Hampton Institute. Another, J.W. Taylor, made a living as an expert in upholstery and cabinet work in Cleveland. Several others worked for Albert Miller, a Belgian cabinet maker who owned a shop in Lexington and specialized in furniture repair. This clock from Colonial Williamsburg was restored by Miller in the 1930s, though it is very likely that the actual work was carried out by the Dunbar graduates in his shop. According to Mr. Smith's profile in The Crisis, quote, at a time when Negroes are more deeply concerned over their economic future, this soft-spoken, genteel Lexington man is making a great contribution to group security by teaching young Negroes a highly specialized work which is in great demand, end quote. Smith's soft-spoken, genteel demeanor indicated how African Americans were expected to behave with their white clients, but it does seem to be the case that by prioritizing bench work in the classroom, Dunbar graduates could and did find their way into local furniture trade to great success. In fact, many of Smith's students went on to work for Earl Brown, who repaired furniture and antiques for dealers and had, for many years, been the only black professional cabinet maker in Lexington. Born in 1898, Brown was first listed in a 1925 city directory as an upholsterer who worked out of 548 Georgetown Street, owned by Reverend W. Judson King, a pastor at the nearby Chandler Memorial Congregational Church. By the 1940s, Brown was listed in the census as a proprietor of his own shop on West 3rd Street, specializing in upholstering and refinishing antique furniture, and he offered a place in his shop to Dunbar graduates looking to learn the trade. By 1940, his former employee Samuel White made an independent living as a repairman across the street from the First African Baptist Church on Price Road. During his career, Earl Brown worked for Lexington's most prominent antique dealers, including Elizabeth Simpson, Catherine Turner, and Mary Irvine. Around 1940, these same dealers encountered a talented young man in Brown's shop, Milton T. Paul, another former Dunbar student. Born in 1921 in Liberty, Kentucky, Paul moved to Lexington as a youth and likely attended Dunbar in the 1930s. When he enlisted in the Army for World War II, he put his occupation down as unskilled general woodworker. However, that designation would change as Paul began working for these dealers in the late 1940s. According to some of the dealers I've spoken to, and corroborated by Paul's late son Billy in that article I mentioned, it was Marie Irvine who first commissioned a Chippendale-style mirror for Milton Paul, which she sold out of her home on Ridgeway Road. Irvine rejected his first 2 attempts and insisted he study the rare English pieces in her collection, supplementing his education under Smith and Brown with access to genuine antiques and design catalogs. It took several years for Paul to perfect his technique to her satisfaction. Milton Paul worked out of a small workshop behind his house on North Limestone Road, where he lived with his wife Amy and their 9 children. According to his daughter Marvetta, he did not have power there for years, operating at a workbench from dawn till dusk and using hand tools into the 1960s, when an antique dealer finally helped him get electricity. Afterward, he had bandsaws and machine lathes. According to Jerry Shrout, Milton also opened a small shop on Paris Pike, but it seems as though the way that the addresses changed over and over again, there was no shop. It was just his workshop behind his house, and the address had changed over time. At the beginning of Milton Paul's career, commissions primarily came from dealers, including Calder Turner, Betty Hoops, and Zeev Faulkner. These dealers brokered orders on behalf of Paul, taking between 10 and 40% of the commissions for themselves. Because direct sales was not a sustainable option for a black man at the time, Paul had to rely on his professional associates in the antiques trade, which not only disempowered him financially, but led to situations where Paul had to work for some very racist clients to support his family. In his workshop, Paul made all sorts of furniture, including joint stools, chairs, corner cupboards, and tables. Marvetta recalls that he made a pedestal-style bed and also refurbished and restored antiques and brought them back to life. According to her, he loved old things, and while Paul continued to craft any form commissioned, his skill at making mirrors and his legend grew in tandem. The more he made mirrors, the more he became associated with them. Clients encountered these mirrors on the walls of their friends' homes, and their status grew via word of mouth. In the last 10 years, upwards of 15 Milton Paul mirrors have been sold on the secondhand market, and for upwards of $1,200 a pop. But it really is the case that these have become family heirlooms, and hundreds, if not thousands, remain in private hands. When closely examined, there appears to be no great secret recipe or magic quality to these mirrors. They are, simply put, well-made and lovely interpretations of 18th and early 19th century pieces. To learn more about how he made each mirror, I visited conservator Willie Brown at his workshop Morningside Woodcrafters. And as you can see, Paul used a scroll saw to create the outline of the frame and chamfered the edges with a chisel. In this case, he applied plaster molding to the inside of the frame and gadrooned the edge to create various decorative effects. Because he did not have access to gilt, Paul applied gold paint over the plaster surface to create the gilded look. The frames were nearly identical in form to the originals, but he often adapted the size to suit his client's specifications. Paul sourced his secondary woods locally, buying pine or recycling crepe material, but he mail-ordered his veneer. Milton Milton Paul hand-carved other elements of the frame, and his real skill with the chisel is evidenced in the most notable feature of these mirrors, the decorative elements on the crest, sometimes carved in relief or applied to the wooden frame, as seen in the mirrors he made for longtime client Karen Arnold starting in the 1960s. Paul studied antique publications to learn the style, but he also had first-hand experience repairing many of the 18th century looking glasses that came into the dealer shops. The phoenix was his most popular motif, but he also created facsimiles of all kinds of late 18th century neoclassical decoration, as is the case with the mirror made for the Hopemont, which I showed you earlier in the slide. It was also the case that dealers requested that Milton Paul antique his mirrors. Paul would reuse glass from old or broken mirrors and cut them to fit the frame, maintaining the antique patina of his custom pieces. He also rubbed a mixture of soot and wax into the recessed areas of the mirror frame to give depth to the carving. Another technique was to chip away a piece of veneer right at the corner of the frame, as the glue often broke down between the veneer and the substrate of old mirrors. You can see this deliberate act in the mirror in this slide, and Z. Faulkner reports that her sister has another mirror with the same chip in the exact same place. Interior designers who Paul worked for, like Jeanette Marks, requested these cosmetic alterations in order to help maintain the historic appearance of a space that she decorated. But it was also the case that less scrupulous dealers or designers would pass Milton Paul's mirrors off as genuine antiques. In either case, Paul did not control where his mirrors ended up, or how they were represented to clients by these intermediaries. When it came to the consumer side of things, it is entirely plausible that a portion of Milton Paul's success came not from what he reproduced, but how he reproduced it. The labor and specificity of Paul's bench-made antique-style furniture acted as its own commodity. As was the case with furniture produced by the Dunbar School, boutique custom-ordered furniture appealed to wealthy clients in a local market who sought to set themselves apart from their neighbors with their factory-produced Colonial Revival furniture. Equally plausible is the notion that, with the Milton Paul mirror, clients were getting better quality for far less money than they would with a white maker. We should not forget that Paul was unable to truly represent himself for most of his career. Direct clients would not come until around the 1970s, and he was still unable to scale up his business. Paul remained largely dependent on contractual work offered by white Southern dealers. And while I believe many of these dealers had a friendly, even affectionate relationship with him, Paul's occupational mobility, like many of his fellow craftsmen of color, remained constrained by systemic racism and attempts to subvert Paul's artistic control. One of the more explicit examples of this, and I'll just show you some here. One of the more explicit examples of this can be seen on the backs of Milton Paul's mirrors. Early in his career, Paul signed his name on the paper backings of his mirrors. He eventually discovered that certain dealers were removing the paper from the back, either to pass them off as genuine antiques or based on the ugly belief that white clients would not purchase furniture made by a black man. In response, Paul began carving a small X into the back of his frames. This is one of the key diagnostic features of a Milton Paul mirror. Interestingly, this move had the benefit, or drawback depending on how you view it, of enhancing the mystique around Milton Paul mirrors. The X marks conjured associations with work by unidentified craftspeople which collectors fetishized under the collective umbrella of folk art, which one could argue further marginalized and anonymized Paul within his commercial and artistic milieu. But I'd rather look at this from Paul's perspective, as an act of agency and even rebellion. With this small but significant addition, he ensured that his identity could not be erased, nor his legacy forgotten. Before I wrap this up, I'd like to return to the Dunbar School, where it all began. In 1939, William Henry Faust gave a speech over radio, addressing some high points in the educational development of colored people in Lexington, Kentucky. Having labored for years to improve the lives of African American students at Dunbar High School, he expressed his pride in the accolades it had achieved, and he reflected on the change of attitude which had enabled Dunbar's success. Faust concluded his speech with a thoughtful consideration. Quote, "Communities are to be measured not so much by where they are on the ladder of changed attitudes, as by the distance from which they have come to where they are on this ladder." I think I'll leave you with that statement and ask you to consider how far we've come in researching, sharing, and centering the lives and labor of Black craftspeople in America, as well as the distance that remains. I'd like to say thank you once again to the members of Milton Paul's family who gave me their blessing to tell his story today. And thank you to the Decorative Arts Trust for supporting my research and giving me the opportunity to participate in this symposium. Thank you.